The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good afternoon, and welcome to our September Tips and Tricks webinar. Today we will be discussing ES profile masks. So before we get started, a few notes on the GoToWebinar setup. If you're new to our presentation style, there is a Zoom button in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window. You can use that to adjust the scaling of my screen if it appears too large or too small for you. There is also in the GoToWebinar control panel a questions box where you can type any questions you might have. If there's anything that's particularly pertinent to a point I'm discussing, I may pause to address it. Otherwise, I will do a full Q&A at the end of the presentation. As mentioned, this is part of our Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do one webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the next month, we'll place some information on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. So be sure to keep an eye out there. So today we're going to be assessing, as I mentioned, profile masks. The four main things we'll really be talking about are basic profile mask usage and configuration. A lot of this is against the backdrop of comparing against stages, which are another similar tool for restricting access to files, limiting who's affected by specific masks, restricting access to old revisions, and preventing clients from seeing work before it's ready. I will note, in full disclosure, this last point is a little better suited to stages. So I am going to try and show a little of those as well, just to make sure I cover all those bases so we don't have any false advertising there. If you want to see anything comprehensive on stages, Mike did a fantastic webinar on them last November, which is available at this YouTube link here. So the basics of stages are they're a way that you can restrict access to UI features, or sorry, masks. They're a way you can restrict access to certain UI features in ES during a certain portion of workflow. These are applied during milestones or a specific workflow step called set profile mask. There are some instances I'll show as well where you can set them via user profile, but it's not done too commonly. To contrast that, the stages are typically used to specifically control whether or not a file shows, rather than certain UI options. And those are applied via special workflow steps or user profile configuration. So as an example of a stage, just to get the ball rolling, I am going to go create a new project under my customer, and I'm going to use the standard Wiffle dialog document workflow. And this project workflow here called mask no upload. So what you'll notice is when I get into this project, I can barely do anything in here. I can't really upload. I can't see any of the normal menu options. I'm kind of stuck. Turn off notifications real quick. I'm pretty much stuck so that I can't do anything other than validate at this point. And the reason I have this set up this way is this is a scenario where maybe for this entire project, I don't want anyone to be able to do anything until I know we have a PO number for this job. So I have this set up with a simple project workflow that forces me to enter a PO number in a milestone approval. And I am restricting access to everything else until that's done via a mask. So once I add in my PO number, I think I do have to jump back and forth between the document to refresh the UI. That's one quirk I've been noticing of doing this on a project level with masks. But you'll see here now that my upload button and all my other functions have returned. And if I wanted to, I can go ahead and upload files at this point. So the way I set this up, if I take a look at the workflow I used, this is an exceedingly simple, actually I should look at the project workflow, my mistake here. Getting my shortcuts confused. This is a very simple workflow here. It's just only 2 milestones in here. So there is waiting for PO number, and then there is also order received. This first one is a milestone approval that has a mask attached to it. And the second is just a normal milestone, so I have somewhere to go after that. And so the way this is configured is in my milestone, if I go down to workflow milestones, you'll see in here that I have just standard milestone config. It's a step approval. I have my layout attached down here for them to enter the PO number. But if I go over to this user profiles tab, you'll see in here that I have a mask defined. So I'm linking a mask is essentially a special sort of user profile. But what I have set up here is I can choose who gets a mask applied to them and then which mask is applied at this step. So just as the example here, if I use the asterisk, that will be applied to anyone while I'm at this milestone. They'll get that mask. If I wanted to restrict this so that the internal users could upload files, but external users couldn't, I could change that to be applied to the customer mask, so that, or the customer profile. So anyone using the customer user profile gets that mask applied. They can't upload files until we have a PO number, but internal prep employees can. You can also change and use different masks for different profiles in here as well. So I could have it set up so that my customer admin and my customer each get separate user profiles attached. So maybe the customer admin, they get a watermark still attached to images, for example, but they can upload, but the other customer users can't. So you have a lot of flexibility with masks to control who's allowed to do what at certain points in your process. Now, as I mentioned, these are set up using the user profile configuration. So if I go in here, you'll see I have one called Mask Project No Upload. And for the most part, this is going to look like a fairly standard user profile setup. The only core difference in here I have is that I have this Is Profile Mask box checked. This tells ES that it's not a profile that I'm going to be logging in with as a user. It just tells it that it's going to be used as a mask specifically. Now, the other thing that you'll notice in here that is a little strange is with masks, they are subtractive. They're not additive. You can't give someone features they don't already have with a mask. You can only take away features that the user has access to. So even though this mask has access, this profile here as it's defined has the admin section and the search section wide open, it's not going to grant users those functions when the mask is applied. It's only going to look at what they have at their current user profile enabled. It'll look to see, compare what they have that's disabled in the mask, and then turn those features off for them. So if I go into my project view, you'll see that I just turned off all the different options here for upload, file, and so they couldn't really push anything in. So that's basically the core of how that mask is configured. One other thing that's important to note regarding how these masks are applied is they're kind of sticky while you're at a certain milestone in the workflow. So if I go down here to my workflow, I have two milestones in this workflow here, this document workflow. There's apply watermark. I go through two processing steps, preview generation and approval whiffle, and then there's a second milestone, approved. The way this ends up working, as soon as I hit this apply watermark milestone, that is associated with my mask, so it's going to apply my mask, but that mask will stay applied for preview generation and approval whiffle, because the project as a whole sees that I'm still at this apply watermark milestone as an overall status. It won't remove that until I get to the approved milestone down here. So I can go ahead and actually show that real quick too. I think I have a, yep, I have a project here. And this is another example of a mask that I have configured in here. So in this case, what my mask is going to do is it's going to apply a watermark over anything I view in the thumbnail or in dialog, and it's going to prevent me from making annotations while it's at this mask. So you'll see here we have our watermark enabled. That shows up both there and on the thumbnail in ES. And right now in the workflow, we've passed apply watermark, we're past preview generation. That's still being applied until I hit approve here. Then as soon as I hit another milestone, it doesn't matter which milestone it is, that mask will be lifted.
Okay, so to clarify that, because there was a question on that, so what you're saying is you don't have to explicitly make another milestone that has a mask applied to it to give it back. It's just any milestone clears the mask that was set by the first milestone.
Correct. Because the way this winds up working is it's just as long as you're at that specific milestone, it's associated with a milestone overall. But that is a good point to clarify. Now, one other example too is, because these watermarks are pretty useful for, they're actually one of the most common uses we've seen for these masks at customer implementations, is people want a way of having it so that when files have been approved and sent to the printer, the user can no longer add annotations or corrections. So that way that both the user knows that file's gone to press and they can't point back at a comment and try and point a finger at you. But one thing to note too with these watermarks is there is a way you can customize those watermarks. There's a file you have to go to on your server, which I will pull up here in 1 second. Too many windows open on my other screen. So there's a file in here in Symlinux Common Tomcat 7.0 bin env.sh. And this file, this doesn't exist on your system. This is something I believe you'd have to edit on the app server and the web server if you have a distributed install. If this doesn't exist in your install by default, which it might not if you're on ES4, 5 or older, there's usually an env.sh.default in there that you can copy to make a default kind of version of this. This is just where ES stores all its kind of setup variables for when it starts. And there's a line you can add in here, -dcom.dalim.watermark URL, and you can give it a path to a custom watermark file that you want to use. I had a few problems trying to get this working. I think it doesn't like 24-bit PDFs or PNGs, so it is a little finicky on the format you give it, but if you give it a file that it can read, then it'll use your watermark in here when a watermark's being applied. And those watermarks are being set in my profile mask. If I go over here, all I did for this one was I just enabled the watermarking feature here under browsing, and then I just turned off some of the dialog config under the project setup so that you couldn't comment or delete nodes. So it was, once it's gone through the workflow, it's pretty much set and done. Now, one other thing you can do with these too is you can also apply these masks by using the set profile mask tool specifically. I have a workflow here which is set up to do that. So there's also a tool called set profile mask in here, which you can use if you don't want to apply a mask just for a specific milestone. You can use this to set it overall. So just an example of how this would work is you can specify the specific mask, and you can specify whether or not this tool is going to set it, unset it, or replace it with another mask. You can also control it so that it keeps that after restart if the workflow is rerun. The sort of thing this is useful for is if you want to do masks that aren't related to just a specific point in the workflow. This would allow you to, for example, set a mask using a user action, perhaps. Another example I could think of is conditional masks, where maybe depending on information entered somewhere or associated with the file, you might want to apply a mask as the different masks depending on what type of file it is, or just some specific job or status info. So you could use an expression in here, for example, to say, if it's this type of job, you use this mask. If it's this type of job, you use another. The example I set up here is I set this up so if you had a workflow, for example, where you're dealing with both ad and editorial content, maybe I only want to add a mask to the editorial content. So I added a program link into my workflow that's very simple here. I'm just grabbing the file name, and I'm looking to see whether or not that file name contains the word edit. If it does, I'm returning true so that it follows this path and applies my mask. If not, it's just going to continue on to the approved milestone down here. So if I pop into this job, I have 2 files here I believe I can upload. Grab these and push these in. So these are crunching through. So this file here, go ahead and approve both of these. And they're both complete, but you'll see now that the test edit file has the mask applied because it went through my set profile mask tool. This other file does not. And that's even though they're both at the approved milestone here. So if you set a mask directly using the set profile mask tool, then it's not tied to just one specific milestone in the workflow. It stays until you remove it.
Alex,
So
would you go back to the show you workflow that just ran on those files?
sure.
Um, okay, I see where you do have the node tool. I wanted to ask about the canceled on the node tool issue, if that was ever resolved.
You mean where you used to have
But
where
where
you have to put
basically
the node in
it
here with,
cancels the next milestone, so if you try to route back, it can't go that way.
yeah, I don't think that's ever been resolved. So you still generally, if you're doing a conditional link where you have a case where some positive condition needs to be met and you have a second link where it's that if no other link matches, you typically need to stick a node in here. Otherwise, when you follow this branch, the workflow is going to cancel your OR tool, which means the file winds up stopping. So you just need to typically stick a node in here as a buffer. But I got one.
Alex, here's a question I think would be good to answer now. It was, if you use the set profile mask step as you did in your workflow, how does that get unmasked?
That would have to be unmasked by either reprocess depending on the setting that you have configured, or or you would have to have it set up so that you have another one of these tools somewhere in here that unmasks it. The set profile mask tool has three main actions. You can either set a mask, you can unset a mask, or then you can replace a mask. So if I wanted to, but there is also that keep after restart option. So if I don't have this enabled, reprocessing is going to undo that mask when I start from the beginning, if I restart this workflow. If I have this enabled, then it will persist until I unset it. So, and that's
So
actually probably
basically,
one
you
way.
have to stick another one of those later in the workflow to tell it when you want to unset it.
Correct. It's a little more manual of a process. That would be perhaps a case where a mask isn't related to or a use case for that would be when you have a mask that isn't tied necessarily to a specific point in the workflow, but rather something external. So maybe you want to put a hold on a file for some reason. With this, you could use a user action that applies the mask with the set profile mask tool to block comments on that file, for example, until management reviews it. So a little more manual process, but you have a little more control over how it winds up being applied and for how long. Now, there is one last area where you can end up using these masks. You can use the mask on in a user profile to prevent access to revisions. So if I go into my config for, I think I have a user profile in here, admin masked revisions. And what I did in here is I set it up so that I think it's under dialog. I'll pop in here real quick. There is a setting in here, apply profile mask to non-active revisions. And this is another thing that sort of similar to what Mike was just talking about. If you had a case where if you wanted to prevent people from commenting on old revisions, for example, in dialog, but you didn't want to have to deal with rely on milestones, because not every file is going to be completed before you upload a new revision, and you didn't want to rely on user profiles or the set profile mask tool, this is the one case where you can apply a mask directly in a user profile with this apply profile mask to non-active revisions option. So I selected my watermark mask in here, and if I go over to, I think I have a project here. I have this boring normal project. I have a file with just 2 revisions in here if I open these up in dialog. And both of these files are still just kind of same point in the workflow. But as an admin user, I don't have any mask applied. If I log into the profile that I just mentioned here, then if I try and look at this, and I try and go back to revision 1, you'll see I get the watermark in revision 1, but not on revision 2. And this is done not through the workflow, this is done through that profile. If I were to change which revision is active, so if I make 1 the active revision, I guess it's still going to do it on the newest one. So I'll just submit that up to Dalim as a bug, but hey, we're learning live. But one other thing I'll discuss that's pretty much the gist of what I have on masks. One thing I will touch on briefly, as I mentioned, is stages, since these sort of correlate. They're both related in some cases to file permissions. So an example of where stages would come into play here is when you define a user profile, or actually first we'll go back to workflow. When you define a workflow, you can put in stages at different points in the workflow to mark the progress of a file. So for example, I have a stage up here. They renamed the tool in ES5.5 to save working slot instead of working stage, otherwise the same tool. But you have the ability to just kind of find an arbitrary tag which defines where that workflow is in the process. So I have one for internal in here, which I'm actually not using because I didn't need it for my example. And I have a second for external. So you can basically save a snapshot of where the file is in your process. With a stage, what you could do is rather than hiding or preventing a user from commenting on a revision or a specific file, you could block their access to it completely. When you configure a user profile, then, for example, here you can see that you have, I defined here that this user profile is only allowed to see files that are at the external stage. So you can restrict it so they can only see files that have gone to a certain point. This would be, for example, if you had your workflows configured where you needed to work on files internally before sending them to a customer for review, you could keep those files in the same project, but not actually let them see them until you're done working on them and all the internal work is done. As an example of how that would work, just as a contrast to masks, I have a project here. I have 2 files. They're both going through the same simple workflow I just showed. This guy is completed, and this one is still in the internal review because it hasn't passed approval WIFL and been assigned the external stage. If I log in with my profile that can only see the external stage, then what we'll see here is that I only see one of the 2 files. So really the gist of it comes down to if you're trying to figure out which tool is better for which function, stages are best if you need to divide work into, for example, internal versus external, where you're doing wholesale hiding of files from certain users. Masks are more useful for when you need to control access to specific functions in the user interface until a certain point, or during a certain point in the workflow. One other thing too is that Mike brought up earlier, we were talking about this before the webinar. It's generally easier to undo a mask if you run into an issue where you realize you have a mask that is being incorrectly applied. Whereas with stages, if you have a very restricted user, sometimes they won't be able to see the file at all. With a mask, it's a little easier to just move the file past one specific milestone and have it show back up. But that's pretty much everything I had for today. So do we have any questions?
There's one question, I think, is just a point of clarity. Everything you're showing with masking had a watermark applied to it, and I think that was just for visibility. That's not necessary. You can choose whatever you want to apply as a mask.
Correct. That was just for visibility in today's webinar.
Right.
Yeah, because as an example, some of the ones I had with the watermark in here, they're still the same thing. If I were to go and disable that watermark, let's see here, I had, if I disable the watermark in here specifically, I still have all the dialog functions turned off for this mask. So if I were to go back to my watermarking. Actually, let me log in as a user who can see all stages. So you can see this file is at the same mask that it was before. If let me show workflow. So this mask is being applied from before. I don't have the watermark because I disabled it, but because of the mask, I can't annotate this file. So it's really up to you to choose what you want the mask to do. The only rule is that you can't give anyone access to permissions that they don't already have. So those mask profiles tend to look a little strange because of that, since you might come in here for some of those, like the one I had where I literally just turned off a few features in dialog and turned on watermarking. But otherwise, I left this full open, but users aren't going to see most of that because they didn't have it to begin with. One thing you can look at too is if you have your system and you want to look at a mask to get started, Dalim does ship one mask stock with ES, and that is the locked document mask. So that's one that Dalim ships as a default. I believe if you installed in ES5 or later, that's set with watermarking on by default. And I think that might turn off a few dialog functions too. But that's one, if you want to get an idea of how these masks are set up, that is ships with every ES system. So you can always pick that apart and take a look inside. Do we have any other questions there, or is that?
I think that might be it.
Quiet crowd today.
There was one, but frankly, I'm not sure how realistic it is, but I guess we might as well ask all the questions that were asked. And the question was, if a file is sitting at a milestone with a profile mask, can it be unmasked if needed? If for some reason it's decided that they need that profile mask lifted, can that be done?
My belief is, and I don't have a preset test for that, but I can probably whip one up in about 2 seconds here. My guess is that you probably can with a user action, so we'll find out live.
I mean, I was thinking that the easiest way is they could log back in with a different user profile, but that assumes that someone had kind of planned this ahead of time. And this seems like the kind of question where, just out of the blue, someone needs that mask unmasked. So
the one other thing I believe you could do is I believe you could just undo the masks link with the milestone, and that should take effect more or less immediately. But what I think the official way to do something like this would be, where is it under? I think it's under Wiffle, set profile mask. And I believe the mask I have set here is, so if you're in a pinch, I suppose it would help if I link these tools together too. I'll go under user action. We'll make a new action, unmask. I'll make that workflow based. Action remove mask. The target is source object. So we have a file in here that's masked right now. I can't annotate this. And my UI froze. Let's see here. I might have to give my user access to.
did you have a profile mask that took away the user actions?
Shouldn't. Oh, maybe I do. There's no
I
help
noticed that
there.
earlier. You were toggling between two files earlier, and it was turning user action off and on. So I think you might actually have.
I might have actually done that. Probably clicked something when I was testing. You know what I can do? We'll just make the workflow manual start. So I should be able to go in here and enable manual start for this workflow. So I pop back over
Why,
here.
why you use that setting? There you go.
And we'll see what it does. I don't think it took it off. That might only apply for files that have specifically been through the set profile mask tool. Let me pop back up and make sure.
Actually, I think you should look at your user action again, because I think you forgot to set the context on it.
Well, I didn't use a user action there. I just
that's right.
going through the mask.
Yeah.
So it was called mask watermark. It should be the same in this workflow here. We go to so the other thing we could try there that I think would probably do the trick is if I go into my milestone config here. We'll just give it to the customer admin. So that mask's not being applied to me anymore. So if you're in a pinch, you could temporarily disable the mask wholesale. I think that set profile mask tool is only going to unset it if that tool set it itself. I don't think it's going to have any bearing on any masks being applied by milestones.
It'd be interesting.
No, I think yanking it like you did is the best
Run the
way to do
user
it.
action and then log in as the other profile and see if it's masked or not. Sorry if we're boring y'all. We just all kind of testing stuff.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of chances to play with masks these days, so I think I set that for customer, not customer admin.
That's
Maybe it was. I'm running beta patches here, so.
Yeah, it's interesting. They kind of, you can't even launch a dialogue on it now.
I think that might just be my patch.
Yeah, maybe.
But
all right.
I think we'll go with that general rule of
But we can
if you need
find
to
that
undo a
out.
mask quickly.
Yeah, I think that's something good we can play with, and if we find a good solution for that or anything, we can send it out to everybody on the webinar.
Yeah. But yeah, as for now, I think the easiest way if you need to undo a mask quickly would be in the case of a set profile mask tool, just reprocess the file. In the case of a mask being sent in a milestone, just disable it in the milestone configuration. But
All right.
so that was it with questions then, right?
Yep, that should be it.
Yep. Thank you all for attending. Have a good day.
Okay, we'll talk to y'all next time.